Okay, thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. My name is Pooja Merchandani. I'm an associate out of San Francisco. I've been with the firm about 3 years now. I started in our Chicago office and transferred to San Francisco about a year ago. Since I started at Kearney, I've been involved in a lot of strategic work, largely mergers and acquisitions for retail clients. So happy to answer any questions about that when we're at the end in our Q&A section as well.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kyla Balkin. I'm an associate with the firm out of the New York office. Also been with the firm around 3 years. Pooja and I started around the same time. A lot of the work I've done with the firm has been in organizational structure and operating model design, also for consumer goods and retail clients, but I've done some work in our payments practice, in our automotive and transportation practice, so I definitely have had the generalist experience here.
Perfect. So with that, just a quick overview, like Emily said, of what we're going to do today. At this point, we're going to jump straight into a mock case, and then we'll get into a little bit of tips and tricks of what works well in a case interview, and then happy to answer any questions that come through. So before we get into the case itself, this is Pooja. I will be acting as the interviewer, and Kyla will be our interviewee today. So Kyla, whenever you're ready, we can get started.
And just really quickly, I know when you're doing a typical case interview, you would pause to do, calculations or set up your structure. Just in the name of keeping things fairly quick on this webinar, I'll probably not take full pauses. So don't think that you have to move through a case super quickly. I just don't want to bore you, and I want to move through things quickly.
Perfect. So with that, we're going to dive into our client background. Your client, Local Roasters, is a local coffee shop located near a local business school. It is the largest coffee shop when measured by sales, total number of cups of coffee sold, and total pounds of coffee beans roasted and ground in the local town. 2 weeks ago, there was an E. coli breakout in the cafeteria on the business school campus, and it has remained closed. Since the closing of the cafeteria, the owner of Local Roasters has noticed a decrease in profit. Local Roasters is a historical landmark in the town, and they're very concerned about their profitability. They have hired your consulting firm to explain their current situation and provide recommendations to get the coffee shop back on track. With that, the two critical questions facing Local Roasters are, 1, what are the main drivers of their poor profitability? And 2, what possible steps can they take to address these issues and get back on track?
Great. So can I ask just a couple clarifying questions?
Yes, of course.
So is Local Roasters sold in the business school cafeteria or just sold through their stores?
Their products are exclusively sold through their stores.
Okay, and are they a freestanding store or are they a chain and they have a few stores in the town? Do we know?
We do know. They are one single store.
Great. Okay, so just to recap, our client is Local Roasters. They're a local coffee shop located right by the business school. Due to an E. coli breakout, the cafeteria has been closed for 2 weeks, and Local Roasters has noticed a decrease in profitability. So we want to figure out what the issue is, what's driving this low profitability, and also figure out how we can help them raise their profitability.
Perfect.
Would you give me a minute just to set up my framework?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so this is a typical sort of profitability analysis. So we know, so in thinking about my framework, I've set it up as thinking about revenue and cost, because profit is revenue minus cost. And then within revenue, I'm going to want to dig into what makes up revenue. So that's the price of the good and how many units of the good are sold. And then on the cost side, we're going to want to think about variable costs, meaning the costs that are moving around with how many goods are sold, as well as the fixed costs. And just sort of thinking out loud and thinking about the problem statement, one hypothesis might be that with the outbreak, sales are going down, and that's what's affecting profitability. So the quantity of units sold, it's on the revenue side. Another thought might be that the E. coli breakout has caused a lot of fixed costs to go up due to issues in the town. So there are a few different directions we could head in figuring out what the profitability issue is for local roasters.
Perfect. Thanks, Kyla. So just to pause the case here for a second, like we just saw, when we're thinking through the typical flow of a case interview, at the beginning, once you get your prompt and your case context, it's important to really think through your framework and to brainstorm how you want to walk through the case and how you want to break down and solve the problem. We'll get into this later on, but what's really critical in a case interview is to show your problem-solving skills, and this is the first way in which you can do that. What you also heard Kyla do towards the end is develop a few hypotheses. Having a hypothesis-driven approach shows that you're able to take the information that you're given and put it together to have some initial ideas of things that you can test throughout the case. Kyla, anything to add?
No, I think you covered it.
All right. In that case, let's jump back in. So Kyla, thanks for walking through your framework. Where would you like to start?
I think I'd be interested in local roasters' competition in the town. Do we have any information on their competitors?
So like I said earlier, they are the only local roasters specifically in the town. Other than that, we don't really know anything about the competitive landscape at this time.
Okay. What about the different products they sell? It might be helpful to understand, what their product mix is.
Yeah, absolutely. So local roasters sells coffee, smoothies, and sandwiches. And we have a little bit of information on the price and the variable costs of these products. With this information, would you be able to tell me what the gross margin percentage is for these different products?
Sure. So we know that gross margin is sales minus COGS, and then you divide that number by sales. So looking at the data you've given me, I can calculate the gross margin for coffee, smoothies, and sandwiches. So for coffee, I would do $3 minus 60 cents, the sales minus the price, so that's $2.40, and then I would divide that by $3, and that gives me 80%. Similarly, if I were going to do it for smoothies, I would take sales minus COGS, so that's $3, divided by sales, so that's 60%. Moving right along, for sandwiches, I know $8 minus $6.80, sales minus COGS again, is $2.20. $1.20. $1.20 over $8 is 15%. And it's actually interesting looking at these gross margins because it looks like, the high price of sandwiches might drive revenue, but then we see that they're very low margin. So if they're selling a lot of sandwiches, it might drive top line, but not as much bottom line, which I think we might end up visiting later as we think about profitability.
Perfect. Thanks for walking me through your calculations. Now that we know gross margin percent for these different products, is there anything else you'd want to look at to understand their profitability better?
Yeah. Do we have any information on how much of each product they sell in a normal business cycle, maybe before the E. coli outbreak?
We do. We actually have their prices, which you've already seen, and the total units sold in the 2 weeks prior to the E. coli breakout. What we know just from conversations with local roasters is the 2 weeks prior to the E. coli breakout were those 2 weeks were pretty typical of their business.
Got it. Okay. So using this information, we could understand their total sales in a typical given time period of business. So if I were going to calculate total sales, I would take the sales price multiplied by the number of units sold. So for this example, I would do $3 for coffee, $3 times 18,000 cups of coffee. That gives me $54,000. Smoothies are $5 times 6,300 units. So that gives me $31,500 in total sales. Sandwiches are $8 multiplied by 6,000, and that would give me $4,800 in revenue. Is that right?
I'd revisit your sandwiches number maybe. Just take a look at the calculations once again.
Okay, I wrote down my calculations. So $8 times 6,000. Oh, I see I dropped a zero. Okay, that makes sense. $8 times 6,000 units sold obviously could not be 4,800. It's $48,000 in sales. So when I sum those up, I can get the total sales of a typical 2-week period for local roasters. So just adding that up, I see that that is $133,500. So it seems like, you know, they sell a lot of coffee, and then it seems like in terms of food, the customers that come in for food are pretty split between smoothies and sandwiches. So that's kind of an interesting takeaway from this. What I might want to know next would be, do we have this same information, their sales after the E. coli breakout? That would help me understand what's changed before and after the E. coli breakout.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have exactly that. We have their prices, which we're already now pretty familiar with, and then we have their units sold in the last 2 weeks, so the 2 weeks since the E. coli breakout.
Oh, great. Okay, so if I find total sales here, it'll help me see if the issue at hand is kind of, if it's a sales issue or a cost issue, and then we can dig into that. So even before I'm doing any sort of calculations, I'm already finding this data super interesting because I'm seeing that coffee has stayed relatively similar, maybe gone down a little in terms of units sold, but I'm seeing that smoothies has actually decreased a lot, and sandwiches in terms of units sold has increased a lot. So already I'm thinking that, you know, this could be a potential profitability or lack of profitability driver. You know, it could be that people aren't going to the cafeteria, so they need to buy their lunch at local roasters, or I don't know. I'm getting ahead of myself, but maybe they are afraid of fruit because of the E. coli breakouts. They're not buying smoothies. Lots to think about here, so we'll definitely revisit that. But for now,
we should.
but for now,
idea is worth exploring. Yeah.
But for now, just thinking about the task at hand, let's calculate total sales. So similar to what we did before, we're going to take price times total units. So I know that $3 times 16,500 units is going to be 49,500 for coffee. Smoothies is going to be $5 times 2,450 units, and that is $12,250 in sales. sandwiches is $8 multiplied by 13,500 units. I see that that's $108,000 in sales. And when I add that up, I get $169,750. Okay, so already this is very interesting because we know that they're dealing with a profitability issue, but we're seeing right off the bat that this is not a top-line issue because after the E. coli breakout, they're actually they have better revenue, better sales, so this will be very interesting at the end to come back to and figure out how this might be driving profitability. One thing we have not explored yet, as I'm thinking about it, is fixed costs. Do we know if there was any change in their fixed costs after the E. coli breakout?
So we do have some information on their fixed costs. What you have here is their fixed costs for the 2-week period pre and post the E. coli breakout, including their total, and at the bottom we have their total fixed and variable costs.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so looking at this, there are some definite quick takeaways. It looks like, you know, except their rent, which has stayed stable, which is expected barring some major change, all of their other fixed costs have gone up. So clearly something about the E. coli breakout or multiple factors, is driving up utilities, is driving up marketing, is driving up labor. Just a couple hypotheses off the top of my head. You know, maybe more people are coming to the store because they're not getting food at the cafeteria, so they're substituting local roasters, and that could mean that local roasters have to pay their employees to stay overtime. But I think we can definitely revisit these things as well as we think about what's the issue at hand with their profitability.
Perfect. I think those are all things worth exploring as we continue chatting, but we do have a couple of questions about all the data that we've seen so far. So I guess my first question is, what is the net profit for the 2-week period prior to the E. coli breakout?
Okay, so to get the net profit, we would take sales from the 2-week period before, which we've already calculated, and we would subtract total cost. So when I look back at my exhibit, I see that the total sales before were $133,500, and I know that our total cost before from this exhibit you have up is $74,500. So subtracting those from each other, we get $59,000 as their net profit from the time before the E. coli breakout.
Perfect. And considering what our clients are interested in understanding, we also would like to know what the net profit is after the E. coli breakout. Okay,
so similarly, we would take the sales that we calculated from the 2-week period after. We see that that's $169,750. We calculated that already. And then when we look at the exhibit you have up, the fixed and variable costs for after the breakout is $128,750. So if we subtract those from each other, we get $41,000. And that would be our net profit after the breakout. So, you know, our client has said they have a profitability issue. We've gone through their data, and we can definitely validate that that is the case, that their profitability 2-week to 2-week comparison has gone down.
So I understand the profitability from a dollars perspective, but what are those in terms of profit margins?
Yeah, that's a good push because we know that their sales change, so it's important to us to see the margin.
Exactly.
So in order to calculate profit margin, we would take the dollar value profit and we would divide that by sales, similar to what we did for the coffee and the sandwiches, the individual products earlier in the case. So thinking about that, we would take, for before, we know that the profit now is $59,000. We just calculated, and we would divide it by sales from before, which we also calculated at $133,500. So doing that division, our net profit is 44%. Now, if we're going to compare that to after, we would do the same calculation, take our net profit, $41,000, and divide it by our sales after the breakout, which is $169,750, and we see that that is 24%. So it didn't seem like a huge difference. It's somewhat of a difference in the dollar value, but we see it's a super dramatic difference in terms of margin, because we saw earlier that their top line went up, but clearly consumers are substituting between coffee, which is a very high margin good, and instead they're buying more sandwiches, which we know for local roasters is a very low margin good, to 80% margin compared to 15%. So I think doing this analysis of their net profit has at least driven me to one hypothesis as to why the sales are going up, but the profit has gone down.
So I know you just mentioned a couple of reasons why coffee and sandwiches specifically might have changed in terms of their volume sold. But what are your thoughts on why the sales volume specifically for smoothies would change?
That's a good question. One thought is that there's sort of a cannibalization going on. So students are substituting between sandwiches and smoothies. We saw that coffee purchases have stayed fairly consistent, but it could be the case because we see that overall the total units sold is similar. It stayed around 13,000, but it seems like it's more sandwiches and much, much fewer smoothies. One potential reason is that, I think I mentioned earlier as a hypothesis, but could be even a stronger thought right now, is that the cafeteria is closed, you need to buy your lunch, you're probably going to buy a sandwich, which is filling, and maybe not a smoothie necessarily.
That makes sense. I think that's very, very possible. Okay, perfect. So with that, I think one thing that I'd like to go back to is the main objective, or one of the main objectives that we talked about right at the beginning. So far, based on all the analysis that we've done and the numbers that we've seen, what do you think some of the main drivers of poor profitability may be?
So we've seen quite a few. We know one is the one we just discussed, which is that we're seeing an increase in the amount of low margin products purchased, the sandwiches, and we're seeing a decrease in the number of higher margins, the smoothies, that are purchased. Coffee is pretty high, is their highest margin, and it's stayed fairly consistent. Even it's gone down a little bit after the E. coli breakout. So that's one potential. That's one clear driver. Or actually, I guess that's sort of two clear drivers, the increase in sandwiches and then the decrease in smoothies. The other one is on the cost side. We know their variable costs have stayed the same, but we see that their fixed costs almost across the board have gone up pretty substantially. So I think that's another driver. So now we've got something from both the revenue side, a revenue driver, or two revenue drivers, and one cost driver.
Okay, perfect. I think that makes sense. So now that we have an idea of what some of the main drivers of poor profitability may be, what could local roasters do to address these issues and get back on track?
Could I take another minute just to kind of structure my thoughts and my answer here?
Absolutely, take your time.
Okay, so I think similar to the way that we've thought about this problem, we can structure our recommendation or the potential solutions that we could dig into as our work progresses, we could structure them similarly. So you have things on the revenue side and you have things on the cost side. So in terms of solutions on the revenue side, one thing we could do is potentially raise prices. So we know it's price times quantity making up revenue, and we know that sandwiches are pretty low margin but pretty popular right now. So maybe we think about raising prices on sandwiches in order for that product to be more profitable. Another thing is we could try to increase quantity. So we might say run a promotion that encourages people to buy more smoothies or more coffee. Maybe we do like a punch card for the products that we want consumers to buy, like a loyalty card where, you know, if they buy 10, they get 1 free or something like that. And then on the cost side, it seems like from a variable cost perspective, again, sandwiches are super high cost because they're getting them from this third party, which we saw in the exhibit. So since the volume of sandwiches they're selling has gone up so much, maybe they could renegotiate with their supplier for a cheaper rate given their scale of purchasing has gone up. And then in terms of fixed costs, maybe they should look into, I know one that really increased a lot was marketing. Maybe they could look into their marketing strategy. Maybe they've been marketing sandwiches a lot, but realistically they should be marketing their coffee more, which is super high margin, and bringing in new customers for that product.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for brainstorming ideas with us. I think all of that makes perfect sense. And I think local roasters will really appreciate the work that you've done here. All right.
Great.
So, perfect. So that's the end of our case. At this point, what we'd like to do is take a few minutes to debrief. Kyla, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So hope that was helpful. I know it's not exactly like running a case when you're on video and you have you're taking more time to do the calculations and take notes and stuff like that. But I think probably a couple things to point out. One would be, if you notice, when I was doing the case with Pooja, at one point I had a number wrong. I had dropped a 0. And if that happens, it's really not a big deal as long as you've been writing down your calculations. You can flag it, or maybe your interviewer flags it, and you could just go back through and see maybe where you went wrong. Interviewers understand that, you know, you're thinking on your feet and you're doing a lot of paper and pencil and some mental math, and that happens. One kind of trick to maybe avoid that is, before you get into the actual exact calculation itself, you could eyeball the numbers and just get kind of a general sense of what the number is going to be. So if you see it's, you know, $48 times 100 units sold, you know it's going to be approximately 4,000. You know it's going to be, that one's too easy, but you know it's going to be approximately 5,000. So if you get 50,000 as your answer, you can go back and be like, oh, 50,000, I must have done something wrong. And it'll help you prevent saying the wrong number.
Perfect. I think a couple other pieces. One is, at one point in the case, Kyla asked for information on the competitive landscape, and that's not information that I had in the case or was necessary to really work through the problem. And that's completely okay. It happens all the time. And you know, in a situation where this were a real project, chances are you may get some semblance of that information from a client, but we're not trying to solve an entire problem in this case, right? It's a little bit more focused, so it's completely okay if you run into a situation like that. And the second thing I'd like to call out is towards the end of the case, in the qualitative portion where we were talking through potential solutions. If you saw on the slide, and I can flip back to it, there are a ton of different potential solutions listed on this page, and we talked through, I believe, 4 of them. there's no need or no expectation that you'd get through every single bullet point on this page. It's more about showing that you can think creatively and you can pull together all of the information that you've talked about, not necessarily that you can list off everything that could potentially be something that one would talk about in the case situation.
One other thing is you may have noticed that there were times when I was already jumping ahead to a solution. And something you want to watch for in terms of coming across professional and showing that your thinking is structured is it's definitely good to call out some key takeaways that you're seeing in the data, like, oh, we see that, the quantities have changed in terms of the number of smoothies sold. We may want to come back to that. And it's always good to kind of state some high-level hypotheses up front to show your interviewer how you're thinking about the case. But it's also good to kind of stick to the task at hand and move one step at a time. And it's fine to sort of show that you're thinking about the quote-unquote so what of the data and the exhibits, but it's also okay to save, the big problem-solving steps, the recommendations for the end. So there are a few times where I probably jumped too far ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Pooja.
No. Oh, thanks. I think to that point, when you're hypothesizing, especially early on in the case, chances are when you get information later, it's going to take you in a completely different direction, and that's completely okay. It's not about coming to a potential solution right at the start when you're developing your framework or you have the initial case context. It's more about being able to pull together the information and adjust your hypotheses and adjust your approach based on all the new information that you learn.
Yeah, so this was a pretty complete case in terms of we looked at the revenue side and the cost side, and we sort of exhausted all the options. Sometimes you might hypothesize that it's a cost issue, and then you see based on the data that's a revenue issue. As Pooja said, that's totally fine. It's more about updating your assumptions as you go. That's definitely more the skill you want to show in the case interview.
Okay, so with that, for the next few minutes, we're going to talk through some general tips for case interviews overall, and then after that, we'll get into the Q&A section. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about why we use case interviews, and it's largely because they are, to a certain degree, reflective of the types of business problems that you face as a consultant. In a case interview, chances are you're going to be doing some math, you're going to be taking some qualitative information and synthesizing that. You're going to be problem solving and getting creative with the information that you're given, and that's something that as a consultant you do on a day-to-day basis. So the case interview really is a chance to showcase your analytical skills first and foremost. It's about the problem-solving piece and being able to think quickly, to think on your feet. Second, it shows how you can act in a situation where you may not have access to all the information. Similar to the competitor piece we talked about in the mock case, it would be great to understand the competitive landscape for local roasters, but without that information, there's a degree of ambiguity that you have to figure out how to work with, and we run into that all the time on consulting projects. It also is a way, working in this ambiguity is a way to test how and if you're able to really filter out what's important, particularly in a situation where, for example, in a profitability case, you'd want to look at revenue and cost, and if you can only go down one path, it's about understanding what's important in that situation to be able to ideate some solutions. And the last piece here is about communication. In a case interview, you're problem solving on the spot, you're doing math on the spot, et cetera, and that's really a way to showcase and demonstrate your communication skills, which is something that we use our communication skills on a day-to-day basis in consulting, both with your internal team and with your clients. So it's important to be able to demonstrate your communication skills throughout the case interview. So all of that directly translates into what we're looking for in a case interview. first and foremost, it's not about coming to a specific answer or to a specific solution. It's about showcasing how you work through a problem. It's really about the process, and it's really about the process. And I think to that point, it's important to really showcase your ability to stay relaxed, to be confident in your problem-solving capabilities. Like I mentioned before, we want to understand your analytical capabilities, your communication skill set, et cetera, and that's definitely what you want to showcase. I'm not going to walk through each of these bullet points in detail. I think we've talked through the vast majority of them, but I would like to call out the last two. The second last point is about thinking strategically and being organized. And what it really highlights is, when you're thinking through potential solutions to a problem, you're able to bring in outside information. You're able to bring in the feasibility of the solutions that you're suggesting, rather than specifically the case-given information to address a specific problem. And that ties perfectly into the last bullet point, which is about thinking creatively. So it's great when candidates bring in solutions that we've never heard before. It's always nice to hear something creative in the case, and it really does make you stand out.
And also oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
I was going to say, also to Pooja's point, you're coming into the interview with lots of past experiences from interviews or things you're involved with on campus or classes you've taken. You might have a really interesting perspective, and if it's relevant to the case and it helps you solve the problem, you should very much bring it in. Should I take the next slide?
Yep.
Okay, so very tactically in doing a virtual interview, especially a case, you want to make sure you've thought about your environment and all of the kind of logistical elements. So I'm not going to go through every bullet point, but make sure, you look professional, your username's professional, you're in, a quiet room without any, distracting elements or noises. Join early, make sure the technology's working and that the interviewer is going to be able to hear you. I think the last point is very critical because I know we all FaceTime and the tendency is to look at ourselves, but definitely look into the camera so that it's kind of similar to making eye contact like in a real interview. That'll make the interviewer just feel more comfortable.
Perfect.
And then you couldn't see it in this webinar, but it's super helpful to take notes during your interview. And you should also feel comfortable showing your interviewer your notes where it's appropriate. So if you've drawn out a framework, or maybe you have like a decision tree, kind of like the profit slide we had in this case, or the profitability slide, you can feel free to hold that up and show your thinking, just to show your interviewer that you're kind of thinking through things in a logical way. And also, should you get a number wrong, or should you maybe head down a wrong path in the case, that is very much not the end of the world if you've been taking notes and if you can kind of retrace your steps and see maybe where you took a direction that's not where the case was meant to go. Because even though we're talking about solving big business problems, what the interviewer has is only a certain amount of data and one path that the case could go, and that's fine. But I think taking notes and kind of being very thorough throughout the process will help make sure that you don't zig when the interviewer wants you to zag. And then lastly, at the bottom of the slide, definitely practice, practice, practice. You want to go in there super confident, super comfortable, excited to kind of solve this problem. And I think that just comes with practice.
Great. Thank you both for leading us through the case here, and you both did a great job of proactively answering multiple of the questions that came through. So we did receive quite a few, and I think we have a few minutes here to go through some. So I will share our first one here. So do we need to maintain the conversation with the interviewer all the time, even when I'm doing calculations?
So it's definitely a way to engage your interviewer. I highly recommend. I think it's definitely best practice to walk through your calculations with your interviewer. Like Kyla mentioned a couple minutes ago as well, it's a great way to enable both you and your interviewer to pressure test as you're working through the calculations. Honestly, speaking through them will give you a chance to catch any mistakes before you get too far into the details. And if you don't catch it and your interviewer does, they can stop you from doing, too much or incorrect calculations as well. So it's definitely a best practice.
And just to add to that, when you're talking through qualitative things too, sometimes it's more effective you don't want to ramble or just kind of think out loud spontaneously. But if you kind of walk through your thought process for a qualitative thing like, oh, I think this is a revenue problem, and I know that because of this, and therefore X, Y, Z, it helps your interviewer follow your thought process, and it shows that you're putting some structure around your thinking, as opposed to just blurting out an answer and no one knows where it came from.
Great, thank you. And then how many clarifying questions do you recommend asking up front in the interview?
I don't think there's a right number. The clarifying questions aren't really about showing off your advanced thinking capabilities. Like that you can do when you're walking through your framework and through the rest of the case. The clarifying questions, I think, really should just be used to make sure you understand the problem statement and you understand the context. The clarifying question I asked was because you might think, oh, of course their profitability is bad. The cafeteria closed and the cafeteria was selling all the local roasters' food. So you just want to clarify kind of basic things like that and make sure you're clear on the situation. But don't feel like you have to ask them if you don't have them. If you just want to recap and state the problem statement and then go into your structure, I think that's fine as well.
Yeah, I think about it as when you're asking a clarifying question, it's information that you need to be able to inform your framework, not necessarily information that your framework will then help you gather.
Perfect, thanks. And then I think just time for one last question, and I'm going to have you each answer this. So can you each share one piece of advice to help someone go from being a good caser to a great caser? We can start with you, Kyla.
That's a good question. For me, when I was casing, the obvious is practice, because you want to go in there with confidence. You don't want to go in there afraid of the case or afraid of the turn it's going to take. You want to just go in there excited to solve a problem, as cheesy as that may sound. I will say also, if you have a friend who's also doing case interviews, have them case you and have them give you feedback. It's hard to judge yourself, but someone might help you notice any weird tics you have. The reason I did some rambling in this kind of example case was when I was casing, I tended to kind of ramble and get ahead of myself.
I think my tip would be when you're practicing, practice with a lot of different people. Interviewers will have different styles, and if you can practice with friends who have different styles as well, I think it'll better prepare you for when you get into the interview room. It'll also help you stay calm, because chances are that in some way you've seen something similar to the interviewer's style before, so it won't be totally new.
Great, that's good advice from both of you, so thank you. All right, it looks like that's about all the time that we have this evening. So thanks everybody for joining our webinar. We hope you found this very helpful as you start approaching in any interviews that you have.